sound decisions based on the information available. And then finally, thinking about the translation piece, one of the challenges within our drug safety area and DMPK has been, probably as with many, historical LIMS systems for different types of assays. So the DMPK data in different systems, to the in-life data, to the pathology data, and so on. So we've been working with a company called Point Cross, who many of you will already know, to bring together the data from the LIMS systems and also a lot of archive data from documents, historical data, using a sort of semantic integration layer and orchestration layer that they have built to bring together the content with its context to normalize things like conditions, calculations like unit conversions, and so on. And then, of course, using the taxonomies that we have for term harmonization. And the advantage here for the scientists is they can ask quite complex questions that cross multiple data sources. So in this case, perhaps trying to find all the studies that have identified certain types of liabilities, and then to drill down and to access those studies directly. And the final piece wouldn't be complete unless I mentioned personalized healthcare. I think in almost every strategy of every pharma company, including our own, this is a key theme, to personalize the medicines that we're developing to patients that will A, benefit, and B, not suffer adverse events from those medicines. And I think for those of you who are familiar with the clinical space, it is a very traditional area. It's highly regulated, of course, so it makes change sometimes quite difficult to introduce. But some of the things we've been doing there are focused on modeling and simulation. So Roche has some real key successes in modeling and simulation. For example, looking at viral load in hepatitis, as an example. And also looking at things like, for the clinical pharmacologists, who have a very, very traditional working approach, enabling them to actually explore data in the clinic for experimental medicine studies, for example. So I hope you see there's a few examples there dotted around this sort of conceptual R&D roadmap that are supporting decision-making. Now, bring it all together, of course, this has to be an integrated environment. And also, there's kind of a knowledge layer. And I just picked a couple of examples here. So within the Roche environment, we have something called the research annotator. So if you want to make a comment, an annotation about any of our objects, whether they're genes, whether they're molecules, assays, and what have you, many of our applications are enabled and integrated with this research annotator. You can add an annotation in one system, somebody else can see it in another system, and so on. So it introduces some of that, if you like, what would be tacit knowledge traditionally into more explicit form in the organization. Idea Farm is a crowdsourcing tool that we use for scientists to post problems that they're having or questions that they have. For example, it's used by the chemists a lot for new synthesis routes. So they can post a challenge, you know, how do I produce this in a more efficient way, a more effective way with fewer steps? And they get a great response from the community around them. So again, it can shortcut a lot of the trial and error perhaps that we've had in the past. And the final example down here at the bottom, which you can't read, but this is a compound knowledge tool. So our chemists actually, when they've overcome significant challenges in project activities, they actually publish that challenge in the form almost like a scientific paper. And now we have actually well over 1,000 of these within the Roche environment, fully integrated with our compound search and what have you. So again, people can look up problems that we've previously overcome, so we're not repeating those same decision errors. So I mentioned the vision. It's a big vision. It's a challenging vision. But where I really challenge myself now, actually, as I've been preparing this presentation, when we look at where we invest our time and our money, and I think this is true of the whole industry, not just of us in Roche, we spend the majority of our time and effort on, I would say, efficiency-based informatics solutions. So electronic lab notebooks, LIMS systems, sample management systems, instrument support, data management, and what have you. Now, these are critically important, don't get me wrong. If these aren't in place, the whole foundation is missing. But I just wonder whether, second question, whether we don't spend too much of our internal energies on these things at the expense of those things which really differentiate us in terms of innovation. So if you remember, the big challenge is to get more efficacious compounds, to understand disease biology much, much deeper. And yet we spend probably, I don't know, 70, 80% of our resources on LIMS, on sample management, on all of these very important but very costly things, which are ultimately not competitive, they're pre-competitive. So my question here is, why don't we collaborate more on some of these major, costly, pre-competitive platforms and spend more of our resources on the real value-add decision-enabling tools? And we had the Pistoia Alliance meeting yesterday, and this is, of course, a key theme of Pistoia. And it doesn't necessarily mean collaboration just between pharma companies. It can be with vendors, it can be with academic institutions, and so on. Just in some way, recognizing it's pre-competitive and not having to essentially take all the cost ourselves and to recreate in every company the same solutions. So my final section is really looking into the future a little bit more. So I think if you went back to 1890s or so and you asked this lady who's on her way to town in her buggy, what would she most like? You know, what does she really need in her life? She would have probably described you something like a super horse. And this same gentleman around the same time, you probably all know this very well, had a completely different concept. So this is well quoted, but Henry Ford really was thinking, if you like, beyond what people were asking for to see what their real need was and what the potential of new technology could deliver to their situation. And similarly, if we ask our scientists in this decade, you know, what do you really need? Most of them will describe you some new sort of computer system, a faster computer, a better application in some way. And what I'd like to show, a couple of things now, are things that I think scientists are not asking for, but for sure we as a community of scientific informaticians can bring to the table and potentially have a lot of value. So the first example has a lot of similarity to the keynote we heard yesterday from Stephen Wolfram, and actually uses a different example to his system, although both, I think, potentially are playing in the same space. So this is really the challenge of natural language processing, enabling computers to do some of the reasoning that otherwise a scientist would not be able to do because of this complexity. So if you read this statement, Fred saw the mountains flying over Zurich. It's not a very grammatically correct statement, but I think all of you in the room will have a certain picture, which hopefully looks something like this. Fred's flying over Zurich and sees the mountains below. But of course, to a computer, it could equally be interpreted in this way. And the reason, of course, you made the correct kind of picture was you have prior understanding. The probability of a mountain flying is pretty low compared to the probability of Fred flying, and so on. There's a very simple illustration of how difficult it is for computers to understand, in inverted commas, this rich language that we work with. Now, we heard about Watson yesterday, and we were sort of partly comparing it with Wolfram Alpha, and there are some significant differences. But if you've seen Watson in his success or its success, I'm going to call him him because I just find it impossible to call him it. So Watson won Jeopardy quite convincingly, and those from the US, I'm sure, will have seen this. So Watson is an IBM Grand Challenge in the tradition of things like the chess challenges and the genome assembly challenges that they've done in the past. And the challenge for Watson was to compete on kind of equal terms with the human competitors in Jeopardy, the general knowledge quiz. So, for example, Watson he couldn't have internet connectivity during the game, so he was equally kind of disadvantaged as the human competitors. He had to interpret the questions in the same way that the human competitors did. So I think it's a very interesting, if you get a chance, on YouTube there's a number of videos about the development of Watson and also to watch the Jeopardy game where he competed. I think for every computer scientist, informatics professional, it's really an interesting thing to watch. So Watson was loaded with his kind of knowledge world. So it included electronic encyclopedias, Wikipedia, and what have you, the Bible, the New York Times archive, the Internet Movie Database, the Beatles lyrics catalog, a number of sources that kind of fall into general knowledge kind of categories. That was the first piece. So Watson has a kind of a knowledge base. Second thing is Watson was fed with example questions and their success or non-success from previous matches of Jeopardy. And from that, Watson had to reason, if you like, or derive the heuristics for success. So that's this piece down on the bottom here. So he's being fed with the previous questions and whether they were successful, and the answers and what was successful and what was not, and had to derive then the heuristics, if you like, the reasons for success. So Watson is not programmed from scratch for every different eventuality. It's a computer learning, essentially a learning approach. And then finally, he has a decision engine over the top, which uses a number of different machines, essentially kind of competing for finding the correct answer. And then there's a probabilistic layer, which looks at the different responses as they come in and basically has to determine whether the probability of having the right answer is in favor or not, and then make a response. And of course, as you know now, Watson won convincingly. And I think one of the questions, I guess this is the thought for us today, is what's the application of this type of technology to our understanding of disease biology and our ability to enable scientists to cope with this huge complexity and huge volume of information. So what, I think we're all familiar with text mining and natural language processing and what have you. What astounded me when I saw the Watson videos was actually how rich and how, if you like, human-like Watson could actually work. So with the approaches, Watson was able to interpret successful outcomes for things like synonyms. Of course, that's not so hard. But things like cryptic questions and puns and jokes, he was able to also determine. So here's a little challenge for you. So one of the clues or one of the questions was Baracks Andean pack animals. And this was in the category of presidential rhyme time. So just put your hand up when you've got the answer. Good, a few people. So I tell you, Watson did this in a couple of milliseconds, so you're already... Okay, so quite a few of you got the answer. So the answer is Obama's llamas. Okay, so he was able to derive, if you like, deconvolute the cryptic, which was Barack is Obama, and the pack animal is a llama, and also able to make the response that actually rhymed, because this was one of the prerequisites of the category. So in principle, I think Watson has the components required to support decision-making in our world. The challenge, of course, is our world is a little bit more complex than these static knowledge facts, if you like, from a general knowledge quiz. So the potential's there. I think we're a little way off actually applying that directly into our working lives. There's a complexity issue. We also have a very sparse coverage of the knowledge we're interested in. I think, and maybe also very difficult to work with, is we don't know how sparse that coverage is. So I think it's easier if you know you have a certain percentage coverage and where that coverage is. If you don't know actually how sparse you are, that's a very difficult problem to work with this type of system. We also work with dynamics. So, a gene may play a crucial role in a disease at its formation. It may have no role in the latter stages of disease or vice versa. So there's a dynamic to the world that makes these binary sort of, or these static knowledge solutions kind of inappropriate. And of course, within the published corpus of sort of science, there's a lot of ambiguity and there's a lot of erroneous data, as we know. So my kind of thought is this sort of technology, I think we should be looking to find where it can contribute to help our scientists, to guide our scientists towards better decision making, even if ultimately it's not going to make decisions for us.